Hi everyone, welcome to our first webinar of 2024. We're pretty excited with this one. It's another very important topic that I've been asked a lot of questions about. So I'm going to get right into it, if I may, and let's talk about the reason for this particular topic. I've had a lot of boards do not really see the importance of managing the reputation risk. They do not have the appropriate policies or practices in place to do so, and it's often an oversight that they do not see its importance in moving forward. I think that as an organization, you need to be as strong as you possibly can. And the questions I've been asked around this is, how do I even know what reputation risk is? Number one, and when it does happen, there's a reputation threat. What do I do? I don't even know what to do if that ever happened. And thirdly, how do you prevent it from happening? So those are the three particular areas I'm going to cover in today's presentation. I want to make sure that everybody understands exactly what reputational risk is and its impact to the organization. I also want to make sure that everybody knows what to do if they are faced with a reputational threat. And just because you haven't doesn't mean it won't happen. If you don't have the right processes in place, you're highly vulnerable to this happening at some point in the future. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how do you prevent it from happening if you can. And so those areas I'll talk a little bit about. But the questions I keep getting is how do I manage my good reputation now? We enjoy a pretty good reputation in our community. So, you know, why do I need to do anything? And what's the reasoning for having a risk management structure in place to manage this? Well, the important thing to understand is that when this happens, it's going to cause a very significant alert to your community. You're going to have your key stakeholders who are going to be very, very concerned. And it's going to impact your ability to attract even board members if it's not addressed, or even to attract funding support and volunteers. So it's very, very important to the organization. And I've experienced where all those three areas have had a detrimental impact, and it made the board to focus on some recovery actions. And listen, some of them are still feeling the significance of it years later. I'm going to give you a real recent example of one that hit the media airwaves not too long ago, a few years back, and it's still prevalent today. Everybody's still talking about it, and it has to do with Hockey Canada. And you may have heard about it, and I'm sure most of you have. But in Hockey Canada, there was a significant event that happened that caused an impact to their reputation. And that had to do with the cover-up of sexual harassment that was happening with their junior teams. Now, the board missed the boat on that, obviously, and so did the executive director. What had happened, we'll probably never find out for sure, but suffice to say that the impact to that organization was significant. And here is some of the fallout that happened. The CEO of that organization resigned in disgrace and is probably disgraced to this day. The board members, who may not have known what was going on, also resigned or asked to resign in disgrace. And so they're disgraced in trying to get maybe other board seats. And even the funding support from some of the major organizations pulled back their money. And some of them pulled it back indefinitely. Some of them gave back some, but suffice to say, they're very, very concerned at what happened, and they expected changes. And changes are happening slowly but surely. This organization is going to feel that impact for years and years to come. It is a dark moment for them, and a black mark on their proverbial website and their activities. It could have been prevented. That's the cold, hard reality. It could have been prevented if there was right structures in place around governance, around policies, around practices. Obviously, that wasn't the case, and this is what's happening. So now the new board and the new CEO are left to try to restore its reputation. And as I said, it will take some time. So clearly boards are much more aware of what is happening in its industry, in the nonprofit sector, wanting to ensure that their reputation is managed properly, and in fact that their whole risk strategy is something that's important for them now. And you know, the old adage that it takes years and years and years to build your reputation and only a minute to lose it has never been more prevalent than in today's day and age, especially with social media. Things hit the airwaves very quickly and it goes wild. And if this happens to your organization, it becomes more and more and more difficult to try to mitigate any risk that's happening. So it's important that the board understand this, and it's important that the board put in place the risk strategies that they need and not ignore it. Because if you think it's not going to happen here, think again. These organizations that I've seen over the course of my career thought the same thing. It's not going to happen here, and yet it did. And some of them struggled and are still struggling. Some of them came out of it, but some of them are no longer in existence. So it's very, very serious, and something that I think every board needs to be more cognizant and more aware of than they are today. So let's move into what is a reputational risk. Well, reputational risk is any significant threat to your good name in the community. It could be any type of threat, and there's many threats that could happen to an organization. But once that threat happens, it could ruin your reputation if it is not addressed properly. Reputation risk happens from a variety of reasons, and I'm just going to give you four sources that I've had experience with. One is when a board member speaks ill-advised or poorly about their peers on the board, the organization, in public. They may not have agreed with a particular decision, or they may not agree at a direction that the board is going, and they speak about it in a public setting, which causes some concern with those who are listening to this. And if it hits volunteers are going to be wondering, why am I part of this organization then? And it will also impact potentially people that are providing funding support, donors. Donors will be wondering what is going on. Another way that this can happen is if employees are speaking ill about the organization. Let's say there's a toxic environment and they're not happy with the CEO or the management team, and they're blaming it on the board, that the board's not doing anything about it. And they talk about it publicly through social media, even worse. And this has happened. I've seen that happen in the past. And it is very difficult to control, but it is something that is very impactful to the board's reputation. A third item could be volunteers that are not doing their work properly, or harassing clients of the organization, or harassing other volunteers. When that happens, it gets out in the public pretty quickly, and those are things that are subject to legal recourse as well, and something that the board needs to be well aware of. And a fourth and final piece that most organizations really omit and don't think it should be part of the process, but it is, because you can be guilty by association. And that is if you are using the resources of a third party and they're doing something of impropriety and that's affecting their reputation, well, it's going to affect your reputation just by being associated with them. Many organizations now want third-party people to provide the same standards that they're expecting now of their boards and of their people. So it's important to understand where these risks can come from and how they can happen in a minute. And because once it hits the airwaves, you now are in a defensive mode, and now you've got to deal with it. That's the impact to the organization. And when you're in that defensive mode, almost everything you say and do is going to be watched and scrutinized extremely closely. So you've got to be very, very careful. And many organizations, when they're faced with that situation, will hire a firm that specializes in communication to help them get through this, or to mitigate as much of the damage as they possibly can. So you need to be aware of that. and aware of how you need to get in front of any significant situation that happens. When you do that, then you're going to be able to mitigate the risk. But if you decide to just wash your hands and just let it play out, then it's a recipe for disaster for the organization. You just simply cannot do that anymore. You need to deal with it as appropriately and as expediently as possible. So that's the impact, and the last portion of that impact that you need to understand, and I've said this in previous webinars, every action, every decision, everything you do as a board, you need to keep at the forefront what are the sponsors and donors thinking. Because if they are not happy, they are going to withdraw their monetary support, and if they do withdraw their monetary support, your sustainability is now at risk as an organization. So you need to keep them at the forefront, and you need to be communicating to them often, particularly when something like this happens. So now let's move into what happens when there is a reputational threat. The threat can come from a variety of areas, as I mentioned before. So let's talk about how the board should react. First and foremost, you need to put a communication plan in place. The communication plan needs to be aligned to each one of the stakeholders. The board and the management team and the staff need to have a communication piece so they understand what's going on in case they're faced with some requests to answer some questions. Another piece of this is understanding what the donors are thinking. You need to be out to the donors, particularly your key donors, as early as possible to explain to them what happened, why it happened, who it happened to, and what is the impact. So they are fully aware of the situation. And you also need to communicate what action plans you're going to put in place. They need to understand and feel comfortable that you're going to remedy the situation as expediently as possible. So that's another one of the stakeholders you need to be aware of. And the other stakeholders are the volunteers. Because if you do not keep the volunteers comfortable and confident in the organization, it may be difficult to attract volunteers into the future. So you need to understand how they're feeling and to keep them as comfortable and confident as possible. So communicating that process is very, very important. And in that communication, as I said, telling them, all stakeholders, what you are going to do to remedy the situation. And that it may take time. Don't be afraid to say that if it is going to take time. But part of the process is to putting in place a risk management strategy that both manages risk and mitigates the reputational threats to the organization. That's the first and foremost. So let's get into that process a little bit. Let's talk about the risk management function that the board needs to do. And as I said before, thinking that it's not going to happen with this organization and that you don't see the benefit of a risk management strategy, that's not an option. Good governance practices means you need to have a risk management strategy. If you do not, your organization is at risk. I cannot be more blunt about that. You're vulnerable to what could happen, and you're vulnerable to a reputation damage that may not be repairable. So you need to make sure that this is something that is a governance activity of the board. In fact, it is a governance responsibility of your board. Your board is responsible for this. Now, let's talk about some of the things that you would do in a risk management strategy. The board needs to identify all the key risks that could impact it significantly, particularly its reputation. Once they have identified those key risks, they need to identify what is the likelihood of that risk happening to the organization. Is it low, medium, or is it high? And what is the impact to the organization if it did happen? Is that low, medium, and high? And your impact is usually measured from a dollar perspective. What dollar in damages will happen? Is it low, is it medium, or is it high? What you want to focus on, obviously, is the medium to high impact of likelihood and of the impact of it happening to your organization. When you do that, you can now put together some corrective actions. What can you do to mitigate the likelihood of these risks happening and the dollar amount of the impact, if it does happen, to being low. So you would put in all the practices and activities that you think are paramount to the organization to do that, to mitigate that risk and mitigate any reputational damage. You can never eliminate it because it could still happen. But if you're mitigating it as a low risk, you'll be able to address it more expediently and more effectively if it did happen. So once you've done that and put those pieces in place, you would monitor those activities, those action plans, no less frequently than an annual basis, because you want to make sure that they're still relevant, they're still appropriate, and they're still working for you. Some things could be happening around the organization that may require more activities, and that gives you the opportunity to implement those as necessary. So once you have done that and put those in place, now you know that your risk management strategy is working for you, and that the likelihood and the impact of reputational damage could be mitigated significantly. Usually that follows, and part of the action plans are a better governing structure. Most organizations do not have the governing policy that they need to mitigate risk. That is a fact of life. I've seen that over and over and over again in my facilitation with boards and in my experience being on boards. They do not have the necessary governing policies, let alone a risk management policy to help them mitigate risk. So there are some key policies that the board would need to manage and to put in place. And some of the ones that we are very familiar with and we always advocate are things like the director's responsibility policy, the executive director's responsibility policy, conflict of interest policy, harassment and intimidation policy, even a board meeting and conduct policy. Those kinds of policies are very, very important, and there's a number of additional ones that the board should consider, because what that does, it provides guidance to everybody. It provides guidance to the board, it provides guidance to management and staff, and it even provides guidance to the volunteers, particularly the harassment, intimidation, and the code of conduct policy. Everybody will understand what is acceptable behaviors and standards in the organization, and they will be held accountable to that. And it gives the board the recourse if anybody isn't. So it's important that these are the pieces that you put in place as part of your risk management strategy and action plan. Once this is done, the board should be in a better position to create the culture, the environment that they want, where positive behavior, appropriate behavior is evident in all actions, because inappropriate behavior will lead to disastrous results. And if you don't have the guidance and support, that will happen. And I've seen it happen. And I'm going to give you an example of what happened in one of my experiences being on a board. I can give you several, but this one was a very interesting one. And it had to do with a tendering process. And in this particular situation, the board, I'll say up front, did not have two things in place. One thing that they didn't have in place was a conflict of interest policy, and another that they didn't have in place was board meeting conduct policy. Okay, so let me talk to you about what happened. There was a tendering process to have a project done by the board. The tendering process was done appropriately. Tenders were sent out, and they were answered by a number of organizations. So what we did is, we reviewed those over time. And we decided on not necessarily the cheapest that came in, but we looked at what was more important for the organization. Was it the quality of work or what? So we actually decided on a particular answer for one of the organizations that, and advised them that this was the decision. You were awarded the tender, and we were looking forward to starting the project. Well, shortly thereafter, within weeks, might have been days, we received a call from a sponsor. He said, I understand that a situation occurred at an event that was in the public eye where one of your board members spoke out of turn about your recent tender. And what had happened is a particular board member was not happy with the decision that we made on who we awarded the tender to and spoke about it outside. Well, obviously this caused concern with people that heard, and it got back to our donors. And the donor was the one that told us about it and was concerned about our process and concerned about the impact that this particular situation had on our organization and our reputation. This became actually an administrative nightmare because more people came forward asking about the situation. So the board had to deal with this. Did not have a conflict of interest policy, as I said earlier, and it certainly didn't have a board meeting conduct and responsibility policy. So this board member spoke out of turn. What we found out was this particular board member had a relative who was on one of the other tendering businesses and who didn't win the tender, and was upset that that particular person didn't get, or organization didn't get awarded the tender. There was a conflict of interest right from the get-go, and if we had a conflict of interest policy in place, that individual would have been removed themselves from the situation during the review of the tenders, number one. And if we had a board meeting conduct and responsibilities policy in place, he would have understood that speaking outside of the board meeting on any decision that the board makes is not appropriate, particularly if you're not in support of the decision. So we had to deal with that, and in fact, it took us a while to deal with that. That board member ended up no longer being with the board, and through a series of discussions and remedial action, the board member was removed from the board seat. And in addition to that, we built those two policies that we needed to build and put those in our arsenal so that now board members understood what their expectations were. We also had to spend an awful lot of time discussing our procedures and our new approach with our donors to ensure that they felt comfortable continuing their sponsorship with the organization. So this can have detrimental impact if you are not managing it properly. So that's what the board had to do. It took some time. It didn't happen overnight. It took several months. And to this day, we ensure that the board's that board is well aware of what their responsibilities are around risk management. So I'm going to conclude by saying that reputation risk is a real threat. It's something that your organization needs to be aware of. Your board is responsible for ensuring that it has mitigating processes in place. If it does not, it's susceptible to something adverse happening, and now you're behind the eight ball in how you are responding to that situation. Never leave yourself vulnerable. As a board, you are responsible for making sure that you are doing the right things. You have the right behaviors, the right activities, and everybody is supporting the actions that the board needs to do to move itself forward. If you do not, you're at risk in your reputation, and it could be irreparable. Thank you very much.
All right, Daryl. A lot of information in there. I mean, tons of information in there. There was just, as usual, mind blown. So, anyone who didn't get a chance to take all of the notes, don't worry. Those will be on the website with the replay of this. We'll have all of the different little pieces. I just want to go back and talk to you, Daryl, a little bit about a few of the things that you kind of covered there. One thing I know if I was a board chair, I'd be sitting there going, you know, great, I have to have this plan ready, but what are some of the signs I see that kind of got me going, you know what, this may be closer to happening than I thought. It's kind of like some telltale signs that, you know, something's about to go down, or are you blindsided every time?
Well, you know, I've spoken before on board meeting conduct, and let's just talk about that. If the board is not prepared for board meetings or board members are not speaking, you need to understand what's going through their mind. And if you don't have a conflict of interest policy and you're not bringing that conflict of interest situation to the forefront when you're having board meetings to have any board member disclose any conflicts before the meeting even starts, then, you know, you're wondering what's going on. If you were doing a tendering product, in this particular case, we were doing a tendering process. And what was interesting is when we thought back on what had happened, that particular individual was always questioning why we were focusing on one or two and not the others more than, because what we did is we had 10 tenders that were answered, and we brought it down to 3 potential winners, and then we really delved into those 3. And the contract was not awarded to the one that he was related to, who wasn't even part of the 3. And so he kept questioning the 3, but the questions were a little different. So that was a red flag that, when we think back right away that had happened. But there's always red flags when people are, not even thinking about conflicts of interest. And as a board chair, the first thing that would be going through my mind is anybody in conflict here? And, and they may not know what they don't know. And that quite often is the case, that I don't know if somebody's in conflict. They may not even think about conflict of interest, but that's a real situation that they need to be aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, I know in today's world we got cancel culture, as they call it, everywhere, where everyone, you step out of line one way and all of a sudden you're in way more hot water than you probably ever expected. So, I mean, when these things happen, I know it's important to act quickly, to be prepared, to have all the policies in place. But does it typically fall on the board chair? Is it really all about them, or does delegation happen? How does this typically get doled out?
When there is a reputation threat, it's the board's responsibility. The board is accountable for that situation. The board chair is just the lead person. And I mentioned earlier about communicating is getting in front of that as expediently and as effectively as possible. But what the board chair needs to do before he even does that is to call a meeting very, very quickly. And that can be with the entire board, or that can be just with the executive. But to make sure that there is a meeting to discuss the situation, discuss what's happened, why it's happened, who's happened to, what's the impact, what do we got to do next to mitigate this risk, and making sure that everybody's aware. Because if you don't have a policy, you have to have that discussion. If you have a risk management strategy and policy in place, you're going to revert to that policy with the action plan. So it's a lot easier. But once you get together and you decide what all the pieces need to be, then immediately thereafter, you start to communicate. Now, the communication should be only done by 2 people. Typically, it's the board chair and it's the executive director. And they need to be communicating in unison. They need to be making sure that their message is exactly the same to whoever they're communicating to. Obviously, the executive director would be communicating to staff and would be communicating to the volunteers, and potentially the donors, where the board will be communicating to the community at large and also to its own board of directors. So making sure the messaging is complete and accurate and consistent is important. And that's got to happen to each one of those stakeholders almost immediately. And then following that, you put the processes in place. Because in your communication to all the stakeholders, you've told them, this is what we're going to do to fix this. And you want to make sure that you carry that out and you do it as quickly as possible.
Well, thanks again, Daryl. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast again, and we'll be seeing you again soon, because I think we're going to be doing a few more of these in the next few months. I think we're ramping up to try and do. I think the next one is in 2 weeks.
Absolutely. I think it's been so important to have these webinars, Jeremy. We've had a lot of feedback and a lot of response on our webinars. And people are asking different questions and on different things. And this particular webinar today was a result of some of the feedback we received, as was our disciplinary webinar last week. It was on some of the feedback we received. So we've been listening to what people have to say, and we're trying to get the important topics out there to you as quickly as we possibly can.
So, as usual, folks, I'm going to point you to d2sup.com. That's d2sup.com. You can find lots more from Daryl in a better lit setting. We're going to look at your lighting next time, Daryl. You look a little orange here, so we're going to fix that. But if you want to find out anything, and I mean anything about board governance and how to handle your board, get on over there, and Daryl's got lots for you there. So until next time, thank you, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.